Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. If you're not into sports, especially baseball, the Yanks, them bums, Mick Willie and the Duke, the Amazins too, Joe D, Jackie Robinson, Casey, the Boss, Mike Kikich and Fritz Peterson, and Dooley Womack too, change the channel. If you want to spend time with one of the premier sports writers of the last 50 years, talking sports, mainly baseball, a lot of Yankees and Mets, but football, hoops, and hockey too, stay tuned. Joining me is Maury Allen, New York Post sports writer for nearly half-century, truly an Isaac Asimov of sports writing. 2 million words in print, some 10,000 newspaper columns, 35 published books, several on the Yankees, and a few hundred magazine articles. The two most recently released books in March and April are Our Mickey and Yankees, Where Have You Gone? I love them both. But before we get to Dooley, Mickey, and the rest, welcome, Maury.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, Doug.
Oh, man. Talk to me about your background. I've interviewed some of your peers. Rabid Brooklyn kid, Jackie Robinson, the hero. You end up loving and covering the Yankees. Talk about this odyssey, if you will.
I think what really happens to kids in Brooklyn, especially in my time, is we all start out at 10, 12 years old. We play a little ball, play a little high school ball. I went to James Madison High School. Frank Torrey was the big star at the time. And we all think we're going to be professional players. I mean, that's the dream of every kid that plays ball. And suddenly at 14 or 15, you say, hey, I'm really not that good, and I can't hit, and I can't field, and I can't play, but I still love the game. And the idea is, how can you love the game and stay with the game without becoming a player? And the answer is, shut up and keep typing.
Right.
And that's what we did. I started to write as a high school reporter at James Madison High School, City College, of course. I was on the campus.
Well, we have to talk about CUNY.
Right, the school paper. And then my big break really came in the Army. I was drafted in those days, in the early 50s. There was a draft, and I went into the Army, and I didn't want to play soldiers, so I said to my sergeant, or whoever it was in those days, I'm a writer. I've had experience at college papers. And he said, oh, you know, we'll put you in PIO, which is public information. And then I got onto Stars and Stripes. And that was the big break. I went to Japan, and in Japan in 1954, 1955, I worked for Stars and Stripes. I did some sports, but I also did a lot of news, so I got a lot of experience.
Talk about CCNY when you were there, both the college, the city, the basketball scandals, and your writing.
City College in the early 50s, when I was in school, was really the Harvard of New York, the Harvard of the poor kids. It was the most intellectual and the most exciting school that anybody could go to at that time. And it was just an absolute thrill to be in the school. The first day I walked in there and looked at that campus and looked at those buildings and walked through the Great Hall and, walked onto a stadium called Lewis-owned Stadium.
Culture shock from
Culture shock.
From Brooklyn.
And my claim to fame in sports is that I played on the very last football team that City College ever had. We were killed by the basketball scandal, but I was on the football team in 1950. Then the basketball scandal broke. The first thing they did was eliminate football. Why they eliminate football after the basketball scandal, I don't know, but it was all about money. Yeah. But that was a great deal. And the school itself, every minute that I was on campus was fun. It was challenging because the other kids were so bright. You argued all the time. The greatest place was to hang out in the cafeteria and scream and yell. And in my day, in the early 50s, there was an active left-wing communist clubs, organizations. I was a liberal, not so far as a communist, but we argued back and forth what America was all about, what democracy was all about. Then suddenly came in 1950 the Korean War. So that was a threat to our morals, our standards. And also my greatest memory of City College actually was I started in 1949 as a freshman. I was 16 years old. And a lot of the students were World War II veterans. And there I was sitting in a college class after graduating high school with people who were 25, 27, 28 years old. They were actually married. They actually had children. And I was 16 years old, and I'm sitting with these guys, and that was an incredible experience. And every so often we went to the cafeteria, which always was the great hangout. And a guy would say, well, when I was in Bastogne and when I was at Normandy, and your eyes got this big and you were living through their adventures. And that's the way City College was. And it just became the greatest teaching experience about life, about journalism. And later on, of course, I got on the City College paper and learned how to write a little bit. And it was just an emotionally thrilling daily experience. And I rode the subway back and forth. I lived in Brooklyn. And in those days, you could ride the subway as safely as you could be in the fanciest hotel or the safest, police station. And that's when you did your reading. That's when you did your homework.
It was a library. I know. I did it
an hour on the subway. As soon as you got home, you can go about your business, read a book, whatever you want to do.
Basketball scandals. Talk about the team, the scandal, and what it meant to both basketball and to City College.
First of all, Doug, college basketball in the late 40s and early 50s when I was at City College was bigger in New York than anything else. It was bigger than any other sport. It was bigger than the mayor. It was bigger than any politician. It was just the essence and identification of New York City. Those schools, City College, NYU, St. John's, Manhattan College, this was an incredible thing. And when you went to Madison Square Garden, as I did as a student,
on 50th Street.
50th Street and 8th Avenue, and sat up there and watched your team, it was an amazing experience. And not because these players were going to go on and play professional ball. That was not the thing. The thing was to bring glory to your college. And when City College won the double championship in 50, beating the same school, Bradley Tech of Peoria, it was really the highlight of my life. I was 16 and a half years old when this happened, and I thought there could be no greater thrill than that. And all of these guys, Ed Roman, Al Roth, Normie Major, Erwin Dambrot, Joe Gallagher, Ed Warner, these were tremendous figures in our personal lives, and they were so important to us. So we all identified with them. They gave us this enormous pride of being a City College student. And then, of course, a year later came this horrible scandal. I mean, the scandal was so embarrassing. It was
What
so
was
revealing.
the scandal?
The players had taken money, quote, money, $500, $750, $1,000, never to lose a game. That's one small point that through history has been ignored. They never took money so they could lose. They only took money so they can go under the points. So the bookmakers could win the game. Shaving was the term. They saw nothing wrong with it. And frankly, as I later learned as a sports writer and being around the scene and talking to a lot of people, there probably wasn't a named basketball player from 1946 on who played in Madison Square Garden who didn't take some money for shaving. It was just, it was an evil that spread, like a disease throughout all these kids that had the talent to play basketball.
Okay. Let's talk about you. First byline.
First byline, of course, was at James Madison High School.
Oops.
I wrote
What's the piece?
I wrote a little story on the baseball team that I happened to be on.
Hey.
So, it was really funny because the editor said, well, let's have a little 3-paragraph story. And, of course, I added a few paragraphs, got a little color, a couple of cute phrases. So he gave me a byline, which was a surprise at the time. Great thrill. First thing you do is you cut it out, you clip it out, and I showed it to my parents, and they said, "My God, your name is right there, the family name." So that my mother went out and she bought a 50-cent album,
Hey.
and there became my...
Do you still have it?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Somewhere along the line.
Your
I
first
got
college byline, because you did work at CCNY on the campus.
Worked at CCNY on the campus. My first college byline was sort of a feature story on Ed Roman, who was the star of the team, and what his future was going to be. And he didn't talk about pro basketball. He talked about...
Well, excuse me, pro basketball then was
not
nothing.
important.
I mean,
Nothing.
you had the Rochester Royals
Yeah,
and the
that's
Syracuse
right.
Gnats. I mean, it was very
He
local.
talked about being a school teacher,
Yeah.
which he turned out to be. I think he later became a principal. And again, it was the thrill, and it's something that we're talking now over 50 years. It is still the same thrill today. When I write a book, or when I get a byline on the internet, or when I get a byline in a story, there's something that goes through your body, a sort of an electrical charge that is so unique, so different, so universal for all of us in journalism. And it stayed with me, and that was an absolute thrill. And
You're loving it.
I love it, and I loved it as much in those days as I do today. And then what I did is I went in the Army and had a lot of bylines. My first big story in the Army happened to be a sports story. The Yankees, the New York Yankees, came over to Japan after the 1955 World Series. They had lost to the Brooklyn Dodgers.
We'll talk about that one later.
And they came to Japan, and I wanted to interview the star of the New York Yankees, who happened to be Mickey Mantle, who I've written 3 books about since. But Mickey was too busy. Basically, he was drinking. He didn't want to bother. And he said, "Get out of here," that kind of thing. And I sort of got a little wimpy and teary that my assignment was turned down, and I was going to be embarrassed on Stars and Stripes by coming back and saying I couldn't do it. And as a young infielder sitting on the bench, and I go up to him and I say, "Can I interview you?" "Sure, kid, sit down." And he started cursing, kidding around. The infielder's name was Billy Martin.
Wow.
So we became pals, and I wrote this story about Billy Martin and his reaction to being in Japan. And it was a big headline story in Stars and Stripes. And that really launched my journalism career. And shortly after that, I got a big assignment at Stars and Stripes, and I did a big front page interview with General Ridgway, who had won the, basically won the Korean War after MacArthur.
Excuse me.
So that was...
And then you go on to Levittown, Pennsylvania, Sports Illustrated, and then you come to the Promised Land, where many of us still start our mornings with the back of the paper in the sports page. You're at the Post.
We always felt that the New York Post was the greatest sports paper and the greatest newspaper
We're
in America.
talking 1958?
Oh, yeah. I got there in actually 61.
Okay.
But as a kid growing up in New York, of course, I read the Post every day. I was inspired by, Jimmy Cannon and Milton Gross and all the great writers on the Post. And that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a Post sports columnist. My claim to fame in getting my job, which was amusing little tale, there was a sports writer by the name of Arch Murray on the Post, and he drank and he smoked cigarettes. And I had applied for about 3 or 4 years in a row while I was working in Pennsylvania, while I was at Sports Illustrated. I just wanted to work for the Post, never had a job opening. So one day I find out, I read in a paper, that Arch Murray had died in a fire in St. Louis while covering...
and he died, didn't he die because of cigarette?
He smoked,
Set
and
off
he
a
drank,
mattress?
and the cigarette dropped on the mattress, started a fire, he got killed. So instead of being sympathetic to his death, I immediately called the Post up and said, Ike Ellis was a sports editor. I said, Ike, everybody called him by his first. Ike, I know you don't have job openings for the last 3 or 4 years. Now I know you have a job opening.
And he gave you the job?
So he said, come on in. We'll see what we can do for you, kid. I came in. I'm sitting there with Jimmy Wexler, Paul Sand, the 2 bosses at the Post, and Ike Ellis. And Ike says to me, kid, we only have one question for you. And I said, what's that? He said, do you smoke? And I said, no. He said, you're hired.
And then you pulled a major coup early on at the Post. Tell us about that. With one of my favorite characters and yours, Casey Stengel.
My major coup is I get to the Post. This is late in '61, and early in '62, I go to first spring training of the new New York Mets. And Casey Stengel is the manager, and I'm sort of the backup baseball writer. Leonard Schechter was there, Leonard Copper, a lot of fine writers. And I would cover a few games in the Polo Grounds and write features. Then suddenly, Schechter was taken off to do something else, and they said, "You're going to Chicago to cover the Mets." Well, this is my first road trip ever. This is early May of 1962, and I go to famous Wrigley Field, and the Chicago Cubs had a player-manager by the name of Elvin Tappe, T-A-P-P-E. He was a catcher on a team, and they had a rotating system of managers.
It was wacky.
Very
really,
wacky.
truly wacky.
And one of the guys, there were regular coaches, but one of the guys, the player manager, was this catcher. So I get to the ballpark for a day game at 1 o'clock, and I get there at 8:30 in the morning. Well, who's there at 8:30 in the morning? Only Casey Stengel. So I get this idea that, well, Casey was a great player. The Mets have lost most of their games. Maybe Casey's going to play. He's only 70 years old. Maybe he'll play. So I write a tongue-in-cheek, serious story that the Mets center fielder for today's game will be player-manager Casey Stengel.
But at that point, it was reasonable. That this might happen, given that team.
So the Post, being very smart, the desk people being very smart, they pull out of the files a picture of Casey Stengel as a 20-year-old player. They put that picture on the front page of the Post, my story on the front page of the Post. We get a tremendous amount of mail and reaction, and all the other stations and all the other papers pick up this gimmick about player-manager Casey Stengel, 70 years old, and it became not only a great funny story, but it sort of linked me and Casey together, and he loved the idea that I recalled his own career, and we became great pals to the last day of his life.
And Casey, I mean, Yogi's got the reputation for saying some outrageous things, but Casey's mangled the language. In one of your books, you note that he talks about people, friends who are presently dead.
Right.
I mean,
the line, Casey would be talking in his monologue, and he'd be going through hundreds of people that he knew in baseball, Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb and Walter Johnson and Grover Cleveland, all these great names of the past. And then suddenly he'd mention one particular player that he was close to. The one I remembered where the term came up was Zach Wheat, who was a center fielder on the Brooklyn Dodgers next to Casey Stengel, who played left or right field. And he said, and my friend Zach Wheat, well, he's dead at the present time. In other words, you can't call him up, you can't interview him.
Right.
He's dead at the present time.
Believe me.
As if in the future time he'd be alive.
Right, and you can talk to him in an interview. Let's just step back for a moment. You've written about DiMaggio, and you wrote about the 30s and the relationship of baseball to the society. And you argue, I think very legitimately, that baseball was really a unifying force in the 30s. And DiMaggio, in a sense, was the iconic unifier. But there were really multiple dimensions to his personality. And in your book, Where Have You Gone, Joe DiMaggio, you both praised DiMaggio, but also there was a little demythologization there. I almost said that word, but it wasn't quite it.
That's exactly what it was. DiMaggio, up to the time I wrote the book in 1975, was this, as you point out, iconic figure. There was never one word of criticism, one word of sarcasm or reality about DiMaggio's life. He was the perfect human being. I think you have to back up a step, as you pointed out. Baseball in the 1930s in New York City was the essence of all our lives. It was the most democratic aspect of our life. You didn't have to be rich. You didn't have to be white Protestant American. You could be any nationality. If you happen to have that very unique talent of hitting a baseball or throwing a baseball, you could get to the big leagues. Now here comes this kid DiMaggio. His father's a fisherman from Sicily. When I wrote the book, I visited his town in Sicily and talked to the local people. So he comes over, DiMaggio's father, to the U.S., settles in San Francisco. DiMaggio was born in Martinez, California, right outside of San Francisco. He's not interested in school. By the time he's 10, 12, 14 years old, he's an exceptional baseball player. He comes to the big leagues. Every Italian in America suddenly stood proud. I mean, it was the era of, well, all the Italians, they can't speak English well. You know, they're all gangsters. They're all the cliches we know about. They're all the fish peddlers like his father. Suddenly you get this dignified, handsome, incredible athlete, Joe DiMaggio. That made you as an Italian feel better. And what it did is it made you as an American feel better.
But there were a lot of burdens on him to carry that role. A very private, almost insecurely private, but graceful at the same time, both physically and in his demeanor. A guy with a lot of contradictions.
One of the funny stories I tell in a book about Joe DiMaggio when I interviewed him, this is years after he retired, of course, his dignity was the most important thing about him. And I asked him for an interview for the book, and you know, he hemmed and hawed a little bit because he was always a little reluctant about interviews. What are you going to say, and how will I come out? He protected his image. So finally, he agreed. He was at the Plaza Hotel in New York, and he said, "All right, come on up. You can have breakfast with me. You know, if you can be here at 8 o'clock." Well, of course, I was in a hotel about 6:30 in the morning, and I sat in the lobby, and I kept looking at my watch, and now it's 7:30. Now it's 5 minutes to 8, and I finally got the nerve to ring his room, and he said, "All right, come on up." You know, so I come up at 8 o'clock. Joe DiMaggio answers the door. He's wearing a pair of silk pajamas, so beautiful, so well pressed. His hair is perfectly coiffed. He's clean shaven. He looks like a godlike figure. You know, and I'm standing, a kid from Brooklyn, I'm wearing a little ruffled sports jacket. I couldn't believe anybody could look that good at 8 o'clock in the morning. And he said, "Okay, well, have breakfast and stay for an hour," and that's it. Well, P.S., he started talking, and about 9 o'clock at night, still wearing the same pair of pajamas, still unruffled, not one hair moved from his head. Joe finally looks at his watch and he says, "Oh, I think I have to go out to dinner, kid. You know, this is 12 hours later." And it was just an emotional and rewarding experience.
Okay, then the next great figure is not of the 30s, but of the 40s, and one of your heroes, Jackie Robinson, another person of immense grace and dignity and extreme toughness. And you write lovingly in the book that you wrote about him, but elsewhere as well. Talk about Robinson and his time.
Doug, this was really a fascinating experience as I look back on it. In 1945, I was 12 years old, and Jackie Robinson is signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers to play baseball. And I'm a fanatic Brooklyn fan, growing up in Brooklyn, and there's a little headline in the paper, "Dodgers sign Negro ball player," you know. And I turned to my father, and I said, who was a big fan, took me to a lot of games at Ebbets Field. I said, "What's this thing about a Negro ball player?" And he said to me, very matter-of-factly, "There are no Negroes in baseball." And I said, "What?" And the reaction was simply something we never talked about, we never were aware of. We rooted for the Dodgers. If you wore a Dodger uniform, you were a Dodger. Nobody said, where did the guy come from? What color was he? You know, what did he look like? He had Dodgers on his chest. And the fact that they signed this Negro player suddenly made me aware, my God, there really is not a Negro player. And, you know, we knew Lena Horne, we knew Satchmo Armstrong, but we never really thought Joe Louis, of course. And suddenly, this person comes to the Dodgers 2 years later, 1947. And when we're playing stickball in the street, and you take the names of the players, who does everybody want to be? They want to be Jackie Robinson. I'm Jackie Robinson. I can run faster than you. And Jackie ran fast, and that was the big thing. And we all got into, when we played a little baseball, into the pickle. Jackie would run between third and home, and that was called a pickle, and everybody wanted to be Jackie Robinson. And when I wrote the book about him, and this was not really surprising to me, but revealing in a great sense, that when I talked to famous people like Jesse Jackson and other black leaders, they said to me, if there were no Jackie Robinson, there never would have been a Martin Luther King. That he made the most significant breakthrough for black people in America by far. The reason being 98% of the people in America in the 1940s had this emotional connection with America's game, baseball. And suddenly here was a black man playing the game and going through this incredible harassment, incredible racism, hatred, bitterness, these letters.
Talking about nonviolent resistance.
And he just stood there. Tough as nails, played every day.
Poi rispecchia la realtà del paese, in effetti. È un
po'
anche di tutta la Sicilia.
But as a baseball player, he had crossed over, and he suddenly was one of us. You know, he was a Dodger. He was a baseball player. And by 1949, when he won the Most Valuable Player Award, his personality came out. As Joe DiMaggio's personality would come out in private interviews only, Jackie's personality came out after the MVP award, and he was a rather combative person. He was very, very bright. He was very, very strong, and he did more for America, not only for blacks in America, but for whites to sit back and say, hey, take a little notice of what your country is all about. And I think that the history books to this day have not given Jackie the respect and the dignity that he deserves as a historic American figure. And I use a line in the book, you know, quoting myself. There are three great American figures in my lifetime. Not my lifetime, but in American history. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Jackie Robinson.
Well, you're a Brooklyn guy.
Yeah.
I mean, that only goes to say. Okay, we've only got a little less than a minute here, but we're going to continue this discussion for broadcast next week. What I want to ask you very quickly is 1951, Bobby Thompson, what happened?
Doug, that was the most emotional, disappointing, upsetting, angriest I'd ever been in my life. I was 18 years old and Bobby Thompson hits the home run, and I hate the guy, and I call him every dirty name I'd ever heard on the street corner of Brooklyn when he beats our Dodgers and beats Ralph Branco, who was a great hero in Brooklyn. And then I become a sports writer, and I meet the guy, and he's the sweetest man you could ever meet in your life. How can you hate Bobby Thompson?
But you still have to hate him.
You don't hate him. You just keep it in the back of your head what he did.
Okay.
That's it. Why did he do it to us?
Next week.
Thank you.
Again.